Perfect. Okay. Awesome. So sorry about that, guys, our tech issues, but got that settled and we can go ahead and keep going. So let's go ahead and re-walk through setting. So like I had mentioned, I think that setting as a narrative device tends to go unnoticed, right? It's a little bit of an underdog, but it does have a ton of useful information for us when we dig deeper. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So before we consider why setting is significant, let's just go ahead and define it. So setting in the context of prose helps establish the time, place, and the mood of the story of interest, right? And it can also influence our characters, their characterization, and plot development. And so when we want to consider why setting is significant, we want to consider three elements. So the first being context. And you can view context as sort of the glasses or the lens that you're going to use to see the story. And different types of contexts are going to come together and work together to create a complex and layered narrative. And so we're going to consider three types of context for our purposes. The first being cultural context. And cultural context is going to consist of customs, beliefs, and values, right? So we can ask ourselves, did our character have socioeconomic or racial privilege, or were they disenfranchised, right? So all these considerations are going to impact how we reckon with their characterization. Next thing we want to consider is the historical context, right? And this is going to be related to time period. So what major historical events define the era that the piece either took place and or was written in, right? Both are going to be important. And so, for example, literature that was written in the 1940s likely is characters that were directly or indirectly impacted by war, specifically World War II, right? Either through displacement or psychological trauma like PTSD. And so lastly, we're going to consider social context, right? And how this is related to relationships, hierarchies, social structures, what was and wasn't considered socially acceptable during a certain time, and how a character's characterization changes when they're in different locations, right? How are they acting different when they're at home versus how they're acting when they're at work, right? How are they acting when they're with people that are of greater or less social status than themselves? These are the types of questions we want to ask ourselves when we consider context. And so moving on, we also want to take into consideration environment, right? So environment doesn't have to be a physical or geographical setting. It can be, but we can also consider the social and the psychological components of it. And something we want to consider here is social norms, right? So are our characters adhering to social norms, or are they deviant? Are they rebellious? Okay, and our last element that we want to consider is how our characters interact with our setting. How is the setting influencing the character's actions? And so what we want to consider here is the fact that setting can create conflict, right? Conflict that's internal or external, specifically through man versus nature. And I think I think our slides got little, there we go, thank you. Okay, like I was saying, man versus nature. I think a fantastic example of this is The Lord of the Flies, right? So if any of you have read The Lord of the Flies for your AP Lit class, you'll remember that after that plane crash, a group of boys are stranded, right? They're stranded on the island and they have to adapt. They have to learn how to survive without the guidance of any adults. So that'd be a fantastic example for that. And we also want to consider how setting can highlight or contrast or bring out certain aspects of a character, right? So for example, if we're looking at that setting of war, are our characters brave? Do they die heroes? Or do they talk a lot of big talk, but at the end of the day, they run from it, right? They run from the conflict and they live as cowards. So these are all things that are important for us to consider. We can go ahead and move on. Perfect. Okay, so now that we've defined setting and we've talked about why it's significant, let's go ahead and try analyzing it ourselves. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. Yes, he's back, which is a short story. And I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit of context, but I'm not going to spoil too much. So what we do need to know is that our unnamed narrator is going to visit his childhood friend, Roderick Usher, at his decaying ancestral home. And so as the story is progressing, supernatural occurrences, disturbing events are all going to unfold within the house. And ultimately, the story is going to culminate in the collapse of the house, symbolizing, there's that word, right? Symbolizing the fall of the Usher family and their tragic demise. And so the excerpt that we're going to zero in on together is the first part of the short story. And it's going to set the scene for these thematic events to unfold. All right, so let's go ahead and read it together. Okay. It was a dark and soundless day near the end of the year, and clouds were hanging low in the heavens. All day I had been riding on horseback through country with little life or beauty, and in the early evening I came within view of the house of Usher. I do not know how it was, but with my first sight of the building, a sense of heavy sadness filled my spirit. I looked at the scene before me, at the house itself, at the ground around it, at the cold stone walls of the building, at its empty eye-like windows, and at a few dead trees. I looked at this scene, I say, with a complete sadness of soul, which has no healthy, earthly feeling. Okay, so before I walk you through my analysis of it, I want you to go ahead and try it out for yourselves. So I'm going to pose a question to you, and I believe that's on our next slide. Or it might be this one. There we go. So I'm going to pose this question. What are some words and imagery that reveal the setting of this story? I want you to go ahead and drop it in the chat for us. You can think of like, what vibes are you getting from this passage, right? Positive, negative. Why are you thinking of them as positive or negative, right? How are they contributing to the setting of the House of Usher? I'm going to go ahead and give everyone about 2 minutes to try that. Okay, I see Anna said dark and soundless, spooky and empty vibes. Exactly the direction we want to be going in. Perfect. Let's see if we can get some more responses rolling in. Okay, I'm going to give about 30 more seconds for this, but it's totally okay if you aren't sure because we're going to walk through it very soon. Okay, I see Miss Michelle said the imagery of a bleak, depressing atmosphere and subsequent statement from the speaker about the scene having no healthy earthly feeling. Whoa, lots of responses. Awesome, guys. Can anticipate the future demise of the Usher family. Yes, exactly on track. Cameron said cold stone walls, eerie and chilling feeling. And Jasper said, oh, yes, good tip. Thank you. Make sure you're addressing it to everyone. So that way, not only us hosts can see it, but your peers can as well. Okay, awesome. I think everyone who responded did very well on that. You're exactly where we need to be. So we can move on. Okay, so here we've gone ahead and highlighted some of those key words, right? So like dark and soundless, low hanging clouds, devoid or little life of beauty, right? Sadness, a heavy sadness. So I think these are a lot of words that you guys pointed out as well. And so this is all coming together, sort of create this feeling of desolation. I think someone mentioned like eeriness, right? A divine eeriness, because he does mention like the heavens. Also creating a sense of feeling of bleakness, right? So this is creating like a very telling sort of setting. It's revealing a whole lot about the house of Usher as being eerie, as being desolate. So very good job on that one. We can go ahead and move on. Okay, and before we move on, I'm going to pose one more question to you. So how does the setting influence the mood, tone, or meaning of the prose passage? Okay, so now we're going to take a step back. We looked at setting specifically, but now we're going to talk about how a setting related to and influencing mood, tone, and meaning. Okay, so I'm going to give everyone about 2 minutes to drop that in the chat. Think about, we identified that it's eerie. We identified that it's depressing and chilly. But what does that mean in the context of this passage? What mood is that creating? No, this question has quite a bit of meat to it, so no worries. Going to give everyone about a minute more to work on that. Okay, Michelle said, the eerie setting conveys a melancholic mood. I love that word choice there. Throughout the poem, the dilapidated house portrays the overall area as one that is almost devoid of life and spirit. Perfect. And Anna said, it definitely has a dark and stormy night mood. Yes. In other words, the setting sets an ominous tone. Very good, right? And so I mentioned this is the first passage of the short story. So it truly is setting the scene and setting the vibes for what's to come, right? And what's to come are those supernatural, kind of eerie, disturbing events. So exactly, very good. Okay, so let's go ahead and keep rolling. Okay, so we talked about contextualization from the perspective of setting, but now let's take a step back and think of contextualization as a whole. So yes, perfect. So we can actually just go ahead and put all those animations on the slide. Perfect. Thank you, Rashi. Okay. So when we want to consider contextualization, right, we mentioned historical, societal, cultural context, and now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that. So in considering historical context, right, again, I mentioned has to do with time period. And we can consider the political, social, economic, cultural, technological, and historical events, right? So a whole lot of meat there. And so I want to pose this example to you. So, for example, how you approach literature that was written or takes place in Victorian England is going to be very different from how you approach literature written during the Roaring Twenties in America, right? And the reason is the events that are shaping the characterization and the major events that are the basis for the themes are going to be different. So that's why we want to take into consideration the time period, because it is going to influence how we view the major themes that define the story. And so moving on to societal perspective, right? How do real world events influence character behavior, either through direct or indirect impacts, social influence, and moral and ethical, right? So if we talk about social influence, I did mention that that can be related to social pressures, right? So our characters feeling the heat from those around them to be more socially acceptable and conventional in their behavior. So I think a great example of this, if any of you have seen the movie The Help, and you remember the journalist from it, right? The journalist is a little bit avant-garde. She doesn't want to get married, like many of her peers are. And so I think there was a scene where her mother thinks she's a lesbian, consequently, right? Because that was the thinking of their time. So that's another example of that. And also talking about moral and ethical concerns. Characters may be forced to confront moral dilemmas, ethical questions, which in turn are going to create conflict, right? And this can either inspire or hinder character growth, depending on the character and depending on the situation. We also want to consider evolving perspectives, right? How do we see older stories from a modern perspective? And I want to point out that we do have to be careful about how we impose our 21st century lens onto older pieces that we read, right? Because something that was considered radical maybe 50, 60 years ago may seem commonplace and like common decency today. So you want to make sure to keep that in mind as you analyze, because that could affect how you interpret and understand classic texts. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so now to analyze context, we're going to take the example of To Kill a Mockingbird. All right, next slide, please. Okay, perfect. So for those of you who haven't read To Kill a Mockingbird, it's a coming of age story set in a very small, close-knit town of Macomb in Alabama. So it also takes place during the Great Depression, right? And so this is going to be something that defines the story, because that poverty that was associated with the Great Depression is going to affect all the residents of Macomb, even our family of interest, the Finches, who are objectively better off than many of the other citizens in the area, but in consideration are ultimately poor, right? And are living within their means. And we also want to point out the rural landscape, right? Because in comparison to our urban landscapes, our rural landscapes are going to be more traditional, more conservative, right? In comparison to urban landscapes that tend to be more liberal, more progressive. And because this is a book where race is a major theme, The fact that this is taking place in a rural landscape is going to be of great importance, right? Because we are taking place in a setting that is more isolated, that is more traditional. Awesome. We can go ahead and keep going. Okay, so now that I gave you an example, I want to ask you this. How can knowing the context help us better understand the character's attitudes and actions in the story? You can use the example of To Kill a Mockingbird. You can pull from your own experiences, books you read for AP Lit, however you'd like to answer this. I'm going to go ahead and give everyone about 2 minutes for this one. So why do characters act the way they do, right? And how does context, whether it be physical context, psychological, social, how does that play a role in shaping that? Okay, I see Michelle said acknowledging the historical and social context of the novel can contribute to how we understand the nuance of the piece, with the characters' attitudes often being reflective of the time period. Yes, exactly. Exactly on the right track. Perfect. Let's see if we can get maybe 1 or 2 more responses rolling in before we move on. Okay, see, Wendy said that it provides us with a foundation that could have influenced the characters into their present self, which we read about. Exactly, exactly. Awesome job, everyone. And let's go ahead. Oh, yes, Anna said a character is defined by their surroundings and that they attempt to fit in with society or go against it on purpose. Exactly. And of course, whether they choose to, fit in or go against it, it's going to be hugely significant to their characterization. So very good catch there. Okay, awesome job in responding to that one. I think we can go ahead and move on. Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this on to Zoe.
Hi guys! So now we're going to move back into story structure interpretation. If you were here from preview night 1, we did a lot of this, but it's okay. We're just going to go over it again. So we go on to the next slide. Look into what is story structure. So story structure can be broken down into 3 different elements. So we have the elements of structure. This is the basic organization of a story. This includes the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, resolution. There's a lot of words, but the way I like to think of it is like the hill. I remember I did this in like 2nd grade, but it's like a hill where it goes like this, and the climax is always the peak. That's the peak of the story. The exposition is the beginning, and you're working your way up and working your way back down. We're going to get into that in another slide, though. But if we look at the next part, you're all good. Narrative techniques. Different ways authors tell stories. So when an author decides to use sudden exposition, foreshadowing, flashbacks, in medias res, circular narratives, what's the point of this? Why do they do this? And then we have that last part, plot development, the speed and way at which a story unfolds. Why does an author decide to tell a story that way? What effect does this have on the story? What do we do about it? So we're going to break these down a little further. Look at the elements of structure. How does the structure influence a narrative? So what is the structure? We kind of just threw a bunch of words out, but let's go through each of them one by one. We have the exposition first. So this is the bottom of the hill. You're starting here. Introduces setting, characters, and initial conflict. So if you're an OG and you were here, night 1, this is when we met Timmy and Sally. Sally, you just met Sally, right? Timmy and Sally, they live in New York City. They are trying to find their way to school. That would be the exposition. That's the beginning. Is the foundation of the narrative. The next thing would be rising action. So if we go on to the next one, it's increasing conflict and tension leading to a climax. So this is where you're heightening the suspense, the anticipation. So here, Timmy and Sally can't seem to find the train station. This would be increasing the conflict. We haven't hit the climax yet, but some things the suspense is getting there. Are they going to get to school? Are they not? So we get the climax, the turning point, the conflict. This provides a pivotal turning point that drives the narrative toward its conclusion. So the climax is they're actually nowhere near a train station. They might have to walk 10 miles to school. I don't know how this happened, but we're going to go with it. That's the climax. We're at the top of that hill right now. What are the characters to do? We've already built it to suspense. We're here. So what happens now? That's the falling action. You can't stay at that peak forever. Possibly a train crash. We don't know. Anything can happen. Falling action. So how are we getting down from this crazy, they can't find a train, how are they to get to school? Events after the climax lead to a resolution. They see a bus stop 2 blocks away. That's the falling action. The resolution, they get on the bus, they get to school. They concluded. We just went to like a little roller coaster of emotions. We met the characters, we saw a problem, they hit the peak of the problem, and then we kind of weaned off the problem and it was solved. That's typically how stories work, but that's not how they always work. But this is how a linear story will work. And the conclusion really works to tie up all the ends and brings closures to the narrative and reveals the fates of the characters. In this case, Timmy and Sally make it to school on time via the bus. So if we look at that next slide, story structure. So now we're moving on to those narrative techniques. So how do techniques such as sudden exposition, foreshadowing, flashbacks, and medias res, and circular narratives impact a narrative? So we have 3 major things again. First, we have emotion. They can evoke emotions through tension or suspense. So sometimes you do a little flashback, you're adding tension. What did that flashback mean? This little suspense, what do we have to look forward to? Then we have complexity. They create deeper motivations and reasonings behind characters. So if we get those flashbacks or those foreshadowing of the circular narrative, it adds another layer to the story. It adds a deeper understanding and allows for you to actually understand the story and the characters in different ways. Then we have interpretation. So the influence on the overall understanding of the narrative. Sometimes an author might decide to do these different techniques to give you a better understanding of the entire story. This just means that it helps you interpret the message or the theme of the story in a better or different way. Move on to the next slide. We'll look at those narrative techniques even further. So what are all these terms? And we looked at like the purposes, but what are the terms? So first we have sudden expositions. So this is when an introduction of a key story elements abruptly. So it creates a sense of urgency from the outset. So in that Sally and Timmy story, we just met them. They were on their way to school. Everything was calm. Everything was normal. In a sudden exposition, if an author decided to do this, we would be right when they couldn't find a train station. They're creating that sense of urgency, that climax. It's not a peak. We're not going to work our way up to the peak. We're starting at the peak. And an author does this to create a sense of urgency and suspense. They want to evoke emotion out of you. But then we also have foreshadowing, hinting at future events, builds suspense and anticipation. So maybe throughout the story, they're going to hint that Timmy and Sally really can't find any train stations. Maybe there were no train stations. Maybe there was a crash. Maybe there's a news article that pops by. The author's going to do some things that might hint at the fact that they're not going to be able to find a train station to get to school. This will once again build suspense and anticipation. Like that kind of guessing game, we're trying to figure out what happened. Every story has a little element of mystery. Otherwise, they'd all be predictable and boring. So, foreshadowing kind of keeps that light and heavy, but keeps the story more interesting. Sorry. The next one we have is flashbacks. Depictions of past events or memories. So this provides backstory and character depth. So sometimes we're talking about complexity before. You'll never really know a character until you know about their past. An author might decide to really get into their past to explain their actions they're doing now. This adds more complexity to the story. It adds more depth to the story. And when an author decides to do this, you have to really question to yourself, how does this impact what you're reading? especially when you're doing prose. Flashbacks can be a complete technique that you can use and talk about because it is something an author did purposely. You really just have to sit here and ask why. So that next one we have is in medias res. So starting a story in the middle of an action. So this is creating immediate intrigue and curiosity. So this is similar to sudden exposition, but different. So sudden exposition is when you're creating a sense of urgency, where you're kind of like you're starting in it. But in medias res is when you're really starting in the middle of the action. So they start really similar, and they kind of doing the same thing, if I'm being very honest with you. But sudden exposition is just when the beginning of the story is not calm. It's not, this is Sally, this is Timmy, they're going on a walk. It's right to the plot. It's sudden. It's urgent. In medias res is kind of when you skip the beginning. We're not introducing anybody. We're starting with a train crash. That's medias res. We're starting right in the middle of things, which I believe is the Latin translation for that. So, medias res, think in the middle, the median. I don't know if that helps you, but think in the middle. Then circular narratives, ending a story where it began. So we talked a lot about like linear stories with that little hill. Circular narratives are more sort of the circle. So the author might make the creative decision to have the story end exactly where it started off. So in our case, the story will end where Timmy and Sally are in the exact same corner that they were in the beginning of the story. That shows the theme of repetition or closure. Sometimes authors do this to really emphasize their themes. We're ready for the next slide. So story development. How does the pacing and tension in a narrative impact the way that a story develops? So we have, once again, in a set of 3. So the first thing we have is building suspense. If we click. Example, holding information, adding obstacles, or heightening stakes. An author might change the way the plot develops or decide to develop their plot in a way where they build suspense. They want you to be questioning. They want you to understand that the protagonist is going through all these different hoops and waves, and they want you to question why. They want you to be intrigued. We also have time manipulation. So when you go flashback or flash forwarding or not telling the story in a straight way, the author might do this to give you context, maybe to add suspense again. The author is doing these things for a reason. That's what you need to understand. The author isn't deciding to flashback for the sake of showing you Timmy's childhood. It's to show you an important element of the story. And your job is to figure out why it is important and what impact that has on the story. Then we have that third and final one, reader engagement. Sometimes they want you to slow pace. Sometimes they want to be quick pace. They want to control how quickly you're understanding the story. The author wrote this in a particular way. Some chapters will go quicker than others. Some chapters will go slower. They want you to take in the information that they're throwing at you at a certain rate. They want you to understand different key points of the story at certain places. So they really play with that, and they play with that suspense and plot development in a way to keep it engaging, but also to promote their plot and their theme. So here I'm going to pass it off to Anana. Thanks, guys.
Okay. Thanks, Zoe. All right, let's get back into it, guys. So next thing on our agenda is stylistic choices, which I know might sound a little bit broad, but don't worry, I'm going to get into it. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so when we think about stylistic choices, we want to consider how does the author's stylistic choices affect their writing, right? What role is it playing? So, perfect. Okay, so we want to consider first, well, what is style, right? So it's the author's distinctive manner of expression. And you can kind of consider it like fashion styles, right? So just like there are many ways to dress a person or to wear a certain top, there are many ways to craft a singular message. And we're going to do that through the use of diction, imagery, and figurative language. Okay, and so like I just mentioned, figurative language, right? Literary devices are going to play a huge role here in conveying meaning and also in adding depth to the writing and allowing the author to create a unique voice, right? So this is going to pose the question of, well, does the author use metaphors or other types of figurative language, or are they being very blunt? Or are they just putting the facts like they are, right? So all those are going to go into creating a unique voice for the author. And thirdly, we can consider the importance of style, right? Well, why do we care about it? Well, authors are going to use style to enhance the reader's experiences and influence the way their work is being interpreted, right? So whether they choose to be formal or informal, whether they choose to be serious or sarcastic, all these things and these choices are going to play in to how we as the reader interpret the facts that they present to us. And so in the next slide, we're going to go ahead and look at some examples of style. The first being diction, right? So diction involves specific choice of words and language that convey mood and tone. So I like to think of this like if we want to describe the emotion sad, well, we could say sad, or we could say depressed, feeling blue, down in the dumps, depresso espresso, right? We can use slang. So many ways to phrase the same thing. So that's what diction is referring to. Next, we can look at syntax. So syntax is going to refer to the arrangement of words and sentence structure, which is going to impact pacing and emphasis, right? So this can be related to whether we're breaking up our sentences, whether we're creating disruptions in structure, or on the flip side, are we using flowy sentences that are creating a melodic flow? So all that's going to be related to syntax. And lastly, we're going to go ahead and look at tone, right? So we've already talked about tone a little bit. Oops, sorry, Rashi. Next animation, please. There we go. Okay, so we talked about tone a little bit, but let's go ahead and define it. So tone is the author's attitude or emotional perspective conveyed through the narrative voice, right? So is the author choosing to adopt an optimistic or pessimistic tone, or are they choosing to adopt maybe an enthusiastic or bitter tone? So countless tones that an author can choose to convey in their writing. All right, we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to return to our good friend Edgar Allan Poe and the Fall of the House of Usher. So instead of taking a look at setting this time, we're going to analyze for stylistic choices. All right, perfect. So I'm not going to go ahead and read this for us again for the sake of time, but I will ask you this. So how would you analyze the author's use of diction, syntax, and tone in this passage? So how are these elements contributing to the author's style? I'm going to go ahead and give everyone about 3 minutes to answer this one in case you need to skim it again. And then go ahead and drop those answers in the chat. So we're looking at diction, which is word choice, syntax, how are our sentences structured, and tone. All right, about 2 more minutes on this one. Go ahead and keep typing up those responses. Okay, so Michelle said, the pensive diction used to depict the dreary surroundings conveys a lifeless atmosphere, which may establish consequent events that detail the demise of the Usher family, possibly death. Perfect. I'm loving the language choices here, the pensive diction. We have dreary surroundings. We have a lifeless atmosphere, right? So very sort of depressing tone is being conveyed. Yes, perfect. Very good. I'm going to go ahead and give about 1 more minute if anyone else would like to chime in before we take a look at it together. Okay, Wendy said the dashes. Yep. Create a pause. He's thinking, processing his thoughts. Very good. Anna said the repetition of dark and depressing words create depressing and ominous tone. Very good. A negative style, idea of death. No, that's okay. I would agree with you. I think there definitely is some negativity going on here. In the way that he's phrasing, right? Like heavy sadness. It's devoid of life and with beauty. So I would agree. I think there is negativity going on here. So don't worry about it. And again, this is just practice. We don't expect your responses to be perfect. Okay, so very good responses in the chat. So now I'm going to go ahead and walk through it with you guys. So there we go. Perfect. Thanks, Rashi. So like you all have mentioned, we have a lot of vivid imagery going on. We have some haunting diction, a gothic theme. And so all of this is coming together to create a sense of dread and foreboding, right? Like what is he going to find next when he goes into the house of Usher? So we also want to consider how Poe's decision to write in the first person is contributing to this, right? So we talked about narration a little bit previously, but if we consider the use of first person here, it's adding to the eeriness, right? It's adding to the foreboding mood of the story because the narrator is not all-knowing, right? Our narrator is not in third person, and it's not third person omniscient, right? So we're experiencing everything right along with our narrator. We don't have any insight as to what is coming up, right? So we're experiencing everything just as he is. Very good. And we also want to consider lastly, before we move on, the syntax. So I believe, I don't remember who said it, but someone mentioned, oh yes, Wendy mentioned the dashes. So the dashes, just like Wendy said, are adding to the style. They're breaking up the text in a way that affects how we're reading it, right? How it's being paced. How it's being paced, yes. So creating that suspenseful attitude, right, towards how our narrator is going to view the broken down house. So very good. Awesome job on that one, you guys. We can move on. Okay, so for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and skip this CRAM quiz, and we're just going to keep going right into it. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this off to Arnika.
Thank you, Alana. Now we're going to be discussing theme and message. We move on to the next slide. Andrea, next slide. All right. We can move on to the next slide. I think it might be buffering a little bit. All right, here we go. So we just want to talk about how does an author convey the message, and we can look at this with 3 questions. So why is the theme important? How do you recognize the theme and the messages? And what are some common themes? So we're going to be discussing that on the next slide. All right, so first for the first question, themes kind of serve as the backbone of the story. So it kind of reveals like the deeper layers and gives us insight into the author's perspective and the author's purpose. So they're kind of like, imagine you're like reading a book or just watching a movie. You're kind of following the plot and you're getting invested in all the drama that's happening. But what really sticks with you at the end is often like the underlying messages and the themes that the author is trying to convey. They help us make sense of the story's events and the characters, and they give us a deeper understanding of the author's intentions. And they're very essential for engaging with the story on a meaningful level because they kind of challenge us to think critically about the world around us and to question our beliefs and also to just empathize with different perspectives. And for the second question, recognizing theme, so kind of just think about the narrative devices, like the tools that kind of help craft the story and convey the messages. So one of the most powerful tools is like the recurring motifs, the symbols, the conflicts, and the narrative arcs of the story. So for example, for motifs, these motifs kind of just add like they're kind of like these things that appear throughout the story, and they add a layer of meaning because they kind of reinforce the theme in different ways. And there are also these symbols, which are kind of like motifs, but they're more of like objects or images or sometimes characters that kind of represent bigger abstract ideas. So, for example, in The Great Gatsby, there is the green light, which is kind of symbolizing Jay Gatsby's dreams of his like idealistic dreams of having this beautiful woman Daisy, and also just the dream of the American dream in general. So these symbols kind of convey these complex themes in a more memorable way. And um, by using these symbols, they're kind of like sorry. And another point is conflicts, which are kind of very essential in building up the story. So, for example, in a story, a superhero story where someone is fighting against injustice, this kind of can explore deeper themes of power, of freedom, of morality, rather than just being a superficial story. And then narrative arcs, which are kind of like the overall structure of the story, kind of show new things about the themes. And then just some common themes that you see in literature and in fiction or just in TV in general are love, identity, good versus evil, coming of age, survival, freedom, etc. There's a lot of these themes that are kind of they speak about our world around us and our society and the things that are more important in our society. And next animation. So if we move on to the next animation, it just just buffering a little. I think the screen might be buffering a little bit, but actually, if you could click on the side one more time. Oh, it might just be slow on my end. That could definitely be the case. But if the rest of you can see it, then it should be good. So just let me know if you can see the question on the screen. Okay, so everyone can see the question. So it's just a me problem. So the question says, how does a theme relate to topics you learned tonight? So I'm just going to give you about 1 to 2 minutes to answer this question. So just about a minute more, and we can move on. All right, so I'm seeing some answers in the chat. So all of the different aspects of prose, such as stylistic choices, diction, context, are used to communicate the speaker's desired theme or underlying message that they want the audience to understand and take away. Only the different devices can be the theme be presented, otherwise the theme can be miscommunicated or missed entirely. That's a wonderfully put answer, that's absolutely right. And then symbolism and metaphors can contribute to the allegorical context of the novel, with different characters representing contrasting aspects of a certain societal issue, for instance. That is absolutely right. Great job, guys. And let's move on to the next one. True, Michelle is crushing it. Good job. And Anna too. All right. It might be on the next slide. I think my computer just very slow. So,
It's on the context part.
okay, great. So, the first one is going to be context. So, how does the context influence our knowledge of the characters' attitudes and motivations? So, historical, social, and cultural backgrounds, they kind of serve as a lens through which the characters perceive the world and they make decisions about themselves. So, historical context is kind of the impact of the past events on the present circumstances. Social context is kind of like the norms and expectations that shape the behavior in the society. And cultural context is kind of what influenced the characters' values, their beliefs, priorities, and it kind of gives more insight into their own motivations and actions. And this just makes it more complex and interesting, and it kind of gives us empathy towards the character situations. And then for the next one, characters, basically talking about who are the characters and what motivates them. So characters are kind of like the heart of any story, obviously. It kind of drives the progression and it gives it more meaning. So traits are like what makes their personality, their strengths, their weaknesses, and how they just interact with others and the world around them. Motivations are like the reasons behind their actions, and it gives like insights into their workings. And the actions are just what happens when you combine their traits and their motivations and show how they respond to different like challenges and opportunities. And the setting is basically you want to consider how the setting contributes to the story and how it develops the mood, the tone, and the themes of the story. So the setting is not just where the action happens, it's kind of like the backdrop that sets the vibe for the story and how the characters interact with their setting. So for example, if we see like a spooky graveyard at midnight, that's a completely different tone than at a sunny beach at noon. So the vibe is kind of like the mood and the tone for the story. But it does more than just set the scene. It kind of also gives more meaning and more symbols to the story. And the next one is going to be about symbols. So symbols are basically what do objects, ideas, and actions signify. So this can be hidden messages and non-literal messages. So basically whether it's like a recurring theme, a motif, or just like action, they kind of give more secret codes and like secret meanings to the story. So for example, just like an everyday object like a rose, that could just be a symbol of love and passion. And then an idea like freedom could represent like liberation and freedom from like oppression. And their actions can also speak about their inner struggles and motivations. And now onto conflict. How do the characters interact with conflict? We also talked about a little earlier about internal versus external conflict. Internal is more of them interacting with their own mind, and external is just everything else that can influence what they are feeling and what they're doing. And inaction versus action is basically it kind of depends on their internal traits and their motivations, and this shapes their development and the story itself. And now we are on to the Hunger Games. Okay. So I think you guys can see it probably, but we're just going to be talking about the Hunger Games. So if you guys have not read it, we're just going to give a little summary right here. So it kind of follows the protagonist, Katniss, after she navigates a dystopian world where children are basically forced to fight to the death in these really flashy, like gaudy televised events, and they're called the Hunger Games. So Katniss, who's basically a really skilled archer and a really skilled hunter, she volunteered to take her sister's place in the games. Her sister is like 12 years old, so she wants to protect her sister, and it kind of showcases how she's really selfless and determined. So throughout the series, she kind of evolves from like this reluctant hero who's like stepping up to protect her sister and her family into a symbol of rebellion against oppressive government in the capital of Panem. So she kind of faces like all these moral dilemmas, and she grapples with her own sense of identity and responsibility because she's now responsible for this rebellion that is it's a huge movement that's even bigger than herself. And this kind of shows like how she's a more dynamic character and a hero archetype. So her characterization, it's not just about her, it kind of serves as a lens to explore how the author explores the themes of survival, of sacrifice, and of resistance. And this kind of makes her more compelling and relatable to the audience. So first, about her resourcefulness. So she grows up in this really poor district called District 12. And this district is basically, she has to be like really clever on how to survive because if a lot of poverty and a lot of, there's not a lot of food in that district specifically. All the food is like gathered in the capital. So she's like, every day she's like hunting for her family, using like her skills with a bow and arrow to survive. So it's not just about like hunting, it's kind of finding these ways to thrive in a world that's kind of bringing her down. And then about her selflessness. So when her sister Prim gets picked for the Hunger Games, she does not think twice. She literally just volunteers to take her place. And she knows well that she could die. It's very likely that she will die easily because there's like all these bigger and stronger competitors. But this is a really big sacrifice that she's putting her own life on the line to protect someone else she loves. And another thing about her is that she's not just a damsel under stress. She's really, really independent. So she has all these allies like PETA, but they're kind of like she's not relying on them to save her. She's kind of making her own decisions. She's taking charge of her own destiny, and she's showing the world she's like her own person. She has a lot of agency in this novel. So she resonates a lot with the readers because of her resourcefulness, because of her selflessness, and because of her independence. They're kind of messages about like resilience, about sacrifice, and just fighting against oppression. Alrighty. And I believe we are taking a break, but we're gonna take it for 5 minutes. All right. So I believe we probably are on the break side. I just can't see it. But we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then Alana will be back to discuss structuring our prose essay. Have a good break, guys.
All right, guys, so welcome back from break. And so for the last section of today's cram, we're going to go ahead and dig into the essay, the big kahuna, guys. Okay, let's get into it. Next slide, please. Yes, let's get hype. Okay. Perfect. Let's go on to the next slide. There we go. Okay. So, and the next animation, please. Thank you. Okay, so talking about the breakdown. So technically, the prose essay is the second FRQ, right? Just in terms of how they give it to you in the packet. But there is not a specified order that you need to do them in, I believe. Someone might want to fact check me on that, but I do believe that you don't have to do them in the order they are given to you. And so you can kind of play around with that, right? If you know you're better at one essay than the other, you can organize it however you think is going to be best for you to be able to get everything done. Thanks, Erica. Okay, that's been fact checked. Back to what I was saying, you can kind of organize it to best fit your needs and how you know that you perform. And so we kind of recommended here that you take about 40 minutes on it. But like I said, you get 2 hours for all 3 essays. So if you know that you are better in one section and you're going to be able to get that one done faster, you can kind of give and take a little bit more time and a little bit less time as needed. I see. Okay, thanks, Erica, for answering that. Okay, moving on. So in terms of the prompt, you're going to be given a prose passage, could be drama, could not be. We don't know. But you're going to be given a passage and then asked to identify the literary elements and techniques that the author is using to accomplish X goal, whatever that goal may be. And on the next slide, we're going to see an example of that. So don't worry about that. But before we get there, let's talk about some key tips. So we recommend that you read the passage carefully. Okay, you don't want to be, halfway into writing your essay and you realize, wait a minute, that's not what that actually meant. So be sure that you're reading the passage as well as the prompt very carefully. And I'm a big fan of annotations and organizing your essay before you actually start to write. So I'm pretty sure Michelle mentioned, making a note of every literary device you see. This is something I used myself when I took the exam, and I find it really helpful because you don't want to start limiting yourself before you even get into writing, right? You want to give yourself as much information and evidence to work with, and then you can get picky about what you actually want to use. So again, I recommend that you either underline, circle, however you want to do it, all the literary devices that you see. It's good to sort of have like a bank that you kind of keep in your mind to remember. I think Michelle mentioned like imagery, diction, syntax, tone, mood, etc. Any of those are going to be applicable. And then from there, after I've identified literary devices, I like to draw connections between them to see how can I put them in conversation with each other in order to support one common message. And again, that message is going to become my thesis later down the road. And then from there, I can rule out devices that I don't think I can quickly and effectively connect to the thesis that I'm crafting along the way. So again, you don't want to limit yourself at the beginning. You want to get picky later down in the process. And I also recommend that, I think Erica mentioned this one night before, I don't remember which one it was, but you can kind of think of your thesis as like a golden thread, right? And you want to make sure that you're weaving this thread throughout your entire essay, throughout all of your body paragraphs, right? You can write a really beautiful essay, but it can be, completely irrelevant to what they're asking you, to what the prompt is asking you to do. So you want to make sure that you're staying true to your thesis and referencing it in each body paragraph. All right, now we can go ahead and look at that example prompt on the next slide. Perfect, okay. So I'll go ahead and read it out for you. The following excerpt is from Text and Author, date of publication. In this passage, comment on what is being addressed in the passage. Read the passage carefully. Then, in a well-written essay, analyze how author uses literary elements and techniques to convey, portray, develop a thematic, topical, or structural aspects of the passage that is complex and specific to the passage provided. Right, so this is kind of the general outline. Clearly, it'll be fit for whatever passage they give you, but this is what you can expect them to ask you to do. And so remember, your job is to analyze, right? Not just summarize, but analyze and craft a defensible thesis. And so we're going to get into what that actually means on the next slide. Perfect. Okay, so talking about, well, what makes a good thesis, right? So we want to make sure our thesis is going to be clear and focused. It is presenting a specific argument that is debatable, relevant to the topic, and supported by the evidence in the passage. And when we say debatable, when we say defensible, what this means is that we're not just putting forth a fact, right? So for example, we don't want to just say, Timmy is a white man in 1960s Jim Crow era. Okay, cool. That's a fact. We know that. The passage tells us that. But that doesn't really mean anything. That is not creating a literary argument. What you would want to say is, as a white man in the 1960s Jim Crow era, Timmy, consciously or subconsciously utilizes his privilege to uplift his Black coworkers, despite the looming threat of societal backlash. So notice how you can either take a stance that is for that argument, or you can take a stance that is against that argument. That's what we mean by defensible. And so I believe we have 2 examples. If we go ahead and move on. There we go. Okay. So we have an example of what to do, an example of what not to do. So I'll go ahead and read out our model thesis. In author's name passage, the use of symbolism, parallel structure, and character development conveys how the protagonist becomes more self-confident as seen through the protagonist's journey of self-discovery. Personally, I have also used that format of like the use of first literary device, second, third. I think that's just a really clear way to organize it. Again, this is just an example. If yours does not look like this, that doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong, right? There are many ways to do it, but this is just an example of what will earn full credit for that point. And then we also have a poor example of what we don't want to do. This passage is about identity and stuff. The author uses diction and writing to talk about the character. Well, diction, okay, literary device. Writing, not very specific. To talk about the character, well, what are they telling us about the character, right? They did not be specific about that. So that is an example of a poor thesis. This is what we want to avoid. And I believe there's another animation on the slide. Rashi, if you want to click. There we go. Yes. So a poor example, a little pep there telling you that it's not what we want to do. Okay, let's move on. Perfect. Yes. And that's just highlighting those key points that we want to make sure we're hitting when we're writing our own thesis. Okay. I see some awesome engagement in the chat, by the way, but I don't want to derail too much and look at it myself, but thank you to our hosts who are answering questions in there. Keep giving us those questions. Okay, moving on to the next section, which is our evidence and our commentary. So this is where the bulk of your points are going to come from. You can earn up to 4 points in this section. Okay, so if you write paragraphs that are completely unrelated to the prompt or the passage, you're going to get a 0. Okay, we don't want to do that. If you summarize the passage and it's kind of unrelated still, we're just describing it, we're not analyzing it, you'll get 1 point. If you have some relevant evidence, you're making some weak connections, some weak explanations, you'll earn 2 points. But again, we're working up to those 3s and 4s. So you'll earn that 3rd point for doing a solid job of selecting your evidence and connecting it to your claim, which is your thesis, right? So you're drawing out a line of reasoning and you're supporting it. Now, to get those 4 points, that is, you want to make sure that you're being consistent. You're using persuasive support of your thesis, using significant and specific evidence, right? So these are the points we need to hit to get full credit on this section. Let's go ahead and click on those animations. Yes, thank you. So common pitfalls that we want to make sure we're avoiding. Go ahead and click on the animation for me. Thanks, Rashi. Okay, so first thing is don't forget to analyze. I think I mentioned this before, but you want to be wary of having too much summary versus analysis, right? So you want to make sure you're not just restating what's going on, because the reader, they also have access to the passage, right? So you don't have to worry about regurgitating all of it. They can see it themselves. So what you want to do is dig in, draw connections, connect your analysis to your themes and your thesis. And you can think about why is the author using the devices that they are using and how is it affecting your interpretation as the reader. Okay. And we also want to make sure, like I mentioned, go back to your thesis. Make sure that the claims you're making and the analysis you're giving is related to your thesis. We already talked about that a lot, so I'm just going to go on to our 3rd point. Avoid overquoting, right? So again, like I said, the readers who are going to be reading your essay have access to the passage. You do not have to write everything down, okay? You do not have to write out these long, drawn-out quotes because first of all, that's just going to take you way too much time, and you don't have to worry about doing that. What you can do is say in line 10, right, or in line 12, and they will know what you're talking about. Or you can also paraphrase. It does not have to be a direct quote. So you can paraphrase, you can reference it by line, you can choose just kind of words and phrases instead of the whole sentence, however you feel is best fit to your needs. But again, make sure you're not over quoting, because the bulk of your essay needs to be your thoughts and your analysis. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you.
Hey,
Okay, so
Alana,
yes.
before you continue, could you address, Anna just had a question about when we do
Sure.
quote from the passage, how do we use in-text citations, and should we use in-text citations? So could you talk about that really quick? Because I don't think there's a slide about that.
Yes, of course. Thank you for bringing my attention to that. I didn't want to have it open, but thank you. So I think I like, Anna, that you mentioned should we. I don't think you need to. And personally, I didn't. Because again, there's only one passage that you could be referencing, right? And the reader has access to it. So they know that, you're drawing on it. They know that you're taking ideas from it. So, and, again, because that time constraint, it is not necessary to be really picky about that. So I would not worry about that at all. But great question. Thank you for asking it. Okay. Is that also true for question 3? For question 3, so our literary argument one, right? All you really need to do for that one is say the title. If you remember the author, say the author, right? In like the first line of your introduction. Again, that's really all you need to do. You really don't need to get specific in terms of like, pages and whatnot, because you're going off your memory. You don't have the book in front of you. So it is not expected at all that you're quoting specific pages or that you're even making direct quotes at all, because again, you are paraphrasing, you're going off your own memory. But again,
I'll also say, oh, sorry, Alana.
No, you're good.
I'll also say that for the prose passage, as far as in-text citations go, if it really, like, if you really want to draw their attention to like a specific line or section, like maybe something happens in the middle of the story, you can say that, like, in the middle of this short story or in the middle of this passage, so-and-so does, and then like paraphrase or quote. But Alana was spot on. Like question 3, like you don't have the book in front of you. You're kind of going more from memory. Okay, for real. Michelle, that's so funny. Oh man, testing violation all
Don't
over
be that guy.
Don't be that guy. But yeah, you don't have to, like Alana said, it's all the same passage. So if you're referring to a specific line, you can do like the whole parentheses thing, but you're not going to have page numbers. You're not really even going to need to refer to like specific paragraphs. But don't over stress the citation thing. It's not AP Lang. I don't think it's quite as like you're not doing like a synthesis essay. But I'll let Alana get back to it. I just wanted to chime in with that.
That's okay. Thank you, Erica. And I see Anna's question. I can address that real quickly. Would direct quotes be beneficial or impressive? I would say no, because again, it's very unlikely, right? The readers are not expecting you at all to memorize direct quotes just for the purpose of regurgitating them. So it's not going to be impressive. Don't worry about it. Paraphrasing is just fine, and it is what it's expected. So, but great question. Thank you for asking. Your teacher said we should. I don't think you need to. Erica doesn't think you need to. I guess that's up to personal taste, but I would say personally, don't worry about it. I did not do that when I was writing my essay and got a 5. So it is not necessary to do well. Thanks, Erica. Okay, moving on, because I know we're running a little bit. Ooh, we're getting close to our time here. So let's keep going. So talking about our analysis techniques. So first we want to acknowledge that writing this essay can be stressful. We know you're under a time limit. You got to focus on reading, understanding the passage. It's a whole lot of work to do. So we know it's difficult. We acknowledge that, which is why we want to give you a plan of attack. And that's what we're going to walk you through right now. So Rashi, if you could just get those other animations on there for me. Thank you. Awesome. So we have some tips for you. The first being take quick notes, annotate, and ask questions to yourself while you're reading. So I would say you want to do the brunt of your work at the beginning in the pre-writing phase, because that's going to save you time when you're writing your essay. Right. So by annotating, that's going to help you make sure that you don't have to go back. You don't have to keep rereading the passage because maybe you forgot about something, or maybe you're, 2 body paragraphs in and you realize you need another literary device because you want to have it. And then, you can just go back and reference your annotations. You don't have to go back and reread that passage in its entirety. So make sure that you're annotating beforehand, and make sure they're also focusing on big ideas. Okay, you can get niche, you can get super nuanced, but remember, you do have limited time to actually craft your argument. So if you do choose to go that more nuanced niche route, it'll just take you more time to do. So make sure you're focusing on those bigger ideas that are going to be more time effective for you to do. And use your time wisely. So like we said, we recommend about 40 minutes per essay. That'll make sure that you have an equitable amount of time for each essay. But again, if you know yourself, you know that one essay is easier for you to do. You can give and take, take a little bit less time on one essay to give it to maybe an essay that you struggle with a bit more. But you know yourself best, and that is a personal choice. They will not stop you in between essay, right? You just have 2 hours for all 3 essays. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to our last point, our sophistication point. Okay, so this point is new and honestly very hard to pin down. And it's also only 1 point, which means you get it or you don't. So what it includes is insightful and nuanced observations that are developed throughout the literary argument. So I think Michelle mentioned it is something that it is a quality of your essay in its entirety. You can't earn it just by, 1 sentence or even 1 paragraph. It's something that's woven throughout it. And so if you earn this point, this means that your argument was complex and nuanced. And you can, in order to earn it, you can show alternate interpretations. You can connect the prompt to a wider theme. But again, not one route is going to guarantee you this point. It is very subjective and up to the reader. Rashi, if we could go ahead and get those other animations on there. Thank you. Okay. And so like I said, don't stress about earning it. This is a very broad point. It's also a very difficult point to earn. So again, the bulk of your points are going to come from the other sections we talked about, the thesis, the analysis. So this is not going to make or break your score whatsoever. So don't worry about it too much. It's just going to take up time that you don't have. Okay, moving on. Okay, we're going to skip this quiz for the sake of time, but be sure to come back tomorrow where we're going to talk about that literary argument essay that I know some of you had some questions about. So we're going to go way more in depth about that tomorrow, same time. And then also day after that, our MCQ, and the day after that is our finale. So we're going to be covering everything. We're going to be covering everything that we've talked about. Okay, perfect. So now we have about 5-ish more minutes. So if anyone has any more questions that any of us can take for you, just let us know.
I will also say, since we were just on the sophistication slide, you don't have to do all 4 of those things to get the sophistication point. You only have to do 1 of them. So, I mean, if you're really wanting to push yourself, but like Alana said, it's the same point. Like you get 1 point for a thesis, and that's a lot easier to achieve than sophistication. So if you want to go for it, I like how Michelle was very familiar with that rubric, and I definitely recommend doing that. But focus more on that row where you're focusing on your evidence and commentary, your analysis. That's the kicker. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, please throw them in the chat for us to address.
Yes, and also as we're reaching the end, be sure to fill out that survey for us. I think Erica threw that in the chat a little bit earlier. You just got to scroll up a bit because that's going to help us improve and change what we do so we can be better for you. So make sure you're filling that out on the way out.
Okay, so Alana, we do have a question.
Yes.
How would you talk about the conflict in the Poe passage that we looked at earlier?
Do we mean Telltale Heart? I assume we're not talking about House of Usher.
Oh yeah, we did look at 2 Poe passages. It doesn't say, it just says the Poe House of Usher.
Usher, okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pull that up personally so I can look at it. Maybe Rashi, if you want to go back to that too, pull that up for everyone. Okay, that's a really good question because we didn't talk about conflict in House of Usher, but we can now. Okay,
Anna
thanks,
also
Rashi.
corrected and said maybe tension. She was just curious.
Tension. Okay, cool.
Oh, okay. She's saying she's looking at how would you attempt the sophistication point, I guess, with one of those.
Okay. So I think my go-to for this is we did talk about conflict in terms of man versus nature, right? And so we do have our unnamed narrator kind of reckoning with this very depressing, this very eerie, like he's unsure of like what's going to become of his setting, what's going to become of his unknown surroundings, right? So he's describing it as little life, little beauty, dead trees, right? No healthy or earthly feeling. So he's being put in this position of, I don't know what to expect. I don't know if there's going to be some sort of divine, are there going to be ghosts? Are there going to be other sort of supernatural phenomena that I'm going to have to reckon with? He's very uncertain, very doubtful, right? And maybe if we had the rest of the short story, we could go more into depth. But just by looking at that, I would say that man versus nature, kind of the in your face thing there that we could consider in terms of conflict. But I think that's a really good question, Anna. I love how you're looking for, we're going beyond the surface here, giving ourselves extra work to do. I love it. Okay, did that help? Okay, awesome. Thanks, Anna.
And I think that brings us to top of the hour. It's I think it's time to wrap up. So survey was posted in the chat, and you guys, we I don't think so. We'll have to get back to you on that, Wendy. Because this was kind of thrown at us about the same time it was thrown at all of you. So I really don't know. But thank you guys for being here tonight. Alana, I'll let you kind of wrap things up because you're better at that than I am.
Sure, yeah. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We loved having you for night 2. Be sure to follow us on Think Fiveable. Stay up to date on everything Fiveable has to offer, and we'll see you tomorrow night. Bye, guys. Have a good evening.
All right, I'll see you guys all over in the huddle. I
Okay.
think we can just leave. So.